Friends, tonight we continue with the second evening lecture on the World Order letters of Shoghi Effendi that the House of Justice has asked us this year to study in depth. This evening, Amin wants to sit down. It was hard for him to stand for the length of the program last time, and so you see he's going to be comfortably seated here during his talk. Last time, because really he gave us an overview of such an interesting experience that he had with going to visit the World Center to go on pilgrimage in 1934 during the days when Shoghi Effendi was alive. And that took up most of the lecture time last time. So tonight, I believe we really will start on the World Order letters. The first one, just for review, the first one, written in 1931, was entitled The Goal of the New World Order. The second letter, which he may or may not get to tonight, was written in 1933 by Shoghi Effendi, called The America and the Most Great Peace. And the third and last letter, which probably he won't get to until the last lecture next Thursday, was written in 1936, called The Unfoldment of World Civilization. Amin?
The person and the station of the Guardian last time. And I think that from reaction that I got from most of you must have enjoyed it. So if there is time at the end of the evening, we can indulge in some more storytelling, but I think that what I've been charged by the local spiritual assembly of Santa Monica is to provide you with a more systematic review of these three letters of Shoghi Effendi out of the cluster of letters which were published with the title The World Order of Baha'u'llah. And the first one is a letter that's called The Goal of the New World Order. It's a letter written on November 28, 1931. And since it's really the intention of the Universal House of Justice, and I take it as my duty during these evenings to relate these letters as much as possible to the current situations that we live through and the problems that we have, so that we can enhance our understanding of the principles of the faith. I thought it would be interesting to begin with the more, with the kind of transformations that this term world order has had, especially in recent years. For a long time, unless you were reading some very esoteric academic treatments about the future of human society, the only place that you came across this term world order was in Baha'i writings, and specifically dating to these letters of Shoghi Effendi. But as we all remember, about 12 years ago, all of a sudden, we were on the verge of a new world order, and it became a common household word, from the President of the United States to political pundits and commentators and so forth. And not only it became broadly used, but also broadly misunderstood and contested and source of controversy. And I thought that it would be interesting for us Baha'is to see how our understanding of some of these concepts differs drastically from perceptions that the old order brings to these ideas, so that we will not be involved or bogged down in arguments, discussions with people who use it in a different sense, with a different understanding, and who may not necessarily understand just what we are talking about. World order, as it was used, if you all remember, at the outset of the first war against Saddam Hussein, when he had invaded Kuwait, and there was more or less a genuine coalition of nations to throw him out of Kuwait. President of the United States, Bush the father, was the one that began using this term to describe what was happening in the world, how a new order was emerging, that aggressors would be dealt with by collective security and so forth. And in that sense, it wasn't so far from some of the implications of the usage of world order as we Baha'is are familiar with. But immediately, from all angles, the terminology became subject of controversy. On one side, that is those people who felt the wrath of this new world order emerging, thought of it as simply another thin disguise for the enforcing of the will of the strong over the weak, and of maybe behind it the conspiracy of some huge conglomerates, maybe whose interests are not the same as that of the majority of the population of the earth. And on the other hand, within some of these societies of the strong, particularly in United States itself, it was seen as an attempt to surmount the sovereign individuality, the state sovereignty of the country, specifically the United States, with something larger, and that was thought as something absolutely unacceptable. And as I say, the whole term world order became focus of disagreement and division. And after a while, the ones who were using it dropped it, and the ones who were opposing it somehow clung to it as a red letter that they want to oppose. Now, against this background, you see how important it is for us Baha'is to make sure that we do not fall into the trap of arguing either one of these sides, these perceptions, these misperceptions, I should say, of a new world order, because in either case, they really had very little to do with what Shoghi Effendi is talking about, essentially putting out before us the pattern that Baha'u'llah had laid out for the future of human society. So I'd like you to remember this, that when you use the world order, you make sure that you disabuse your non-Baha'i friends of the misperceptions that may have, or at least make sure that they do not attribute to you the kind of misperceptions that they have about this term. Okay. See, this, these perceptions exposes the critical symptoms of the fatal ailments of the old world order. And it's important for correct Baha'i understanding of the term and avoidance of being sucked into the clamor of this dying old world. Now, the salient features of the dying world order, which are the first things that Shoghi Effendi addresses in this letter of 1931, are, number one, makes the point that although this is 1931, good 13 years after the end, the formal end of the First World War, that the war is really not over, that the Peace of Versailles is itself a prelude to a new war. And he quotes Abdul Baha having said very clearly back in January of 1920 that this is the case. And I'm going to read you that quote. Here. This is, in January of 1920, Abdul Baha wrote, the ills from which the world now suffers will multiply. The gloom which envelops it will deepen. The Balkans will remain discontented. Its restlessness will increase. The vanquished powers will continue to agitate. They will resort to every measure that may rekindle the flame of war. Movements newly born and worldwide in their range will exert their utmost effort for the advancement of their designs. The movement of the left will acquire great importance. Its influence will spread. See, we Baha'is don't go around making claims that everything that has happened or is happening in the world was already foretold in our writings. But there are times when that is exactly the case. And here is Abdul Baha putting his finger on several specific problems that emerged from the unconcluded or the misconcluded World War that was going to cause greater trouble. This is the first salient feature of this dying world order. Next, what Shoghi Effendi refers to is the Great Depression, which was really, we in this country think of it as an American phenomenon, but it was a worldwide phenomenon. It was an economic depression that girdled the globe. And its reverberations were felt everywhere. Then he speaks of the signs of the impending chaos and its promise to the Baha'is. Now, this is an interesting thing, that what may look like a crisis or may look like a tragedy for all to see, in fact, has within it a promise for the Baha'is. And here again, I would like to read to you what he says specifically on this subject. He says, "Are we, the privileged custodians of a priceless faith, called upon to witness a cataclysmical change, politically as fundamental and spiritually as beneficent as that which precipitated the fall of the Roman Empire in the West?" This wonderful sense of historical drama and particularly historical parallels that Shoghi Effendi had. That he points out to things that have happened and draws the similarities and the parallels together. It says that we may be precisely in going through another phase and similar to the time when the Roman Empire was falling apart. And believe me, when he wrote this, which was only not even the full century, I said the year 85, I think, or the year 90 of the Baha'i era. I should be more exact, but it's before 100 years has passed. And you think back, let's say, year 90 after the crucifixion of Christ in that time. Who would have discerned that within that small, persecuted, and insignificant group of Christians in several, corners of the Roman Empire are the seeds of a future civilization? And yet that's exactly what it was. And Shoghi Effendi is drawing such a parallel and telling us Baha'is to think about that we have the same promise as that early community. Then he speaks again as another salient feature of this dying world order, the impotence of statesmanship. And it's such a clear and repeated case that people from Stalin to Hitler, Mussolini, and even in the democracies, people who had the fate of humanity in their hands, each one of them was leading humanity in the path of perdition and of tragedy. And again, I'd like to read a passage from this portion of the letter about the impotence of leadership. It says, no appeal for mutual tolerance which the worldly wise might raise, however compelling and insistent, can calm its passions or help restore its vigor. Nor would any general scheme of mere organized international cooperation in whatever sphere of human activity, however ingenious in conception or extensive in scope, succeed in removing the root cause of the evil that has so rudely upset the equilibrium of present-day society. Not even, I venture to assert, would the very act of devising the machinery required for the political and economic unification of the world, a principle that has been increasingly advocated in recent times, provide in itself the antidote against the poison that is steadily undermining the vigor of organized peoples and nations. What else might we not confidently affirm but the unreserved acceptance of the divine program enunciated with such simplicity and force as far back as 60 years ago by Baha'u'llah. And now it is not 60 years ago, but 130 years ago from the time that this was embodying the essentials of God's divinely appointed scheme for the unification of mankind in this age, coupled with an indomitable conviction in the unfailing efficacy of each and all of its provisions, is eventually capable of withstanding the forces of internal disintegration which, if unchecked, must needs continue to eat into the vitals of a despairing society. It is towards this goal, the goal of a new world order, divine in origin, all-embracing in scope, equitable in principle, challenging in its features, that a harassed humanity must arrive. I'd like to remind you again what I said last time of the infinitely expandable time frame of validity of what Shoghi Effendi says in these letters. Just as I read these passages, transfer them to the current situation that we are going through, and you'll see how equally, doubly, more dramatically valid they are now than they were 70 years ago. And again, in case we feel that this is the last chapter of this evolution that Shoghi Effendi is speaking of, I dare say that 70 years from now, we will also find that the directness, the validity of these letters are just as dramatically true. Now, having enumerated the salient features of what is wrong with the old world order, he gives us the guiding principles of the new world order, the principles of World Order of Baha'u'llah. And, of course, the linchpin, the core of it is the principle of oneness of humankind. It's something that is resisted in the days when Shoghi Effendi wrote these letters, and it is still resisted, this idea of oneness of mankind, by the persisting evils of the old order. Most important of all is the evil of nationalism. Nationalism, which in itself was, in a previous cycle of human evolution, was an impelling force towards achievement of greater unity. After all, when human societies did not go beyond tribal identity, it was the power of the idea of a nation and the ideology of nationalism that helped them emerge from that more limited circle of unity to a larger one, so that there was a time in the evolution of human history that nationalism was a positive force, and yet, with passage of time, it now has turned into the most pernicious evil of our time. It is this sense of provincialism, narrow, jingoistic or chauvinistic, however you like to call it, attachment to one's own nation, which stands in the way of realization of oneness of humankind. I'm not talking about 1931 when Shoghi Effendi wrote this, which was true. I'm talking about right now where it's even truer. And I'd like you to relate this to just about every situation that you are confronted with in the daily news on television, whether in our own country, in the United States, or whether in some corner of Europe or the Middle East or wherever you are. It's this nationalistic fervor, fever that is the greatest force of resistance to the emergence of oneness of humanity. And it is then Shoghi Effendi says that a necessary ingredient for making this principle of oneness of humanity something concrete, not just a dream, but something real, is the creation of a federated system of nations. And it's already, this is something that already spelled out in The Secret of Divine Civilization of Abdul Baha, given back in 1875, and it is re-emphasized again in the Universal House of Justice's Peace Statement of 1985. This notion that the world must go beyond the sovereign nation state and create a federal system. Again, you look around and see within a country that itself was created on the principle of federalism, that it managed to survive and grow and achieve the potential that it has achieved so far because of its federalism, yet you will find forces of provincialism, of insularity that resist the same thing that was so beneficial for this country to extend beyond. So you can see through this analysis of Shoghi Effendi what would be a proper Baha'i approach to somebody who opposes a federated system. Right now, for example, in one of the real trouble spots of the world, you know, there aren't just one or two, there are so many, but one of the most persistent and seemingly endless sources of conflict and crisis, which is the Middle East. Take the problem of Jews and Arabs in Israel. Take the problem of the various ethnic groups that are within the artificial borders of this country called Iraq. And you see that if only people were wise enough, that the answer to the solution is so close at hand and so already tried and succeeded in United States, and that is a federated state. And yet there are so many interests of the world or old world order, from in the economic interests of the greater powers over the smaller ones, from the sectarian interests of one religion against another, from the ethnic enmity among various people, all of these things standing in way of achievement of that federated system. And then Shoghi Effendi says that the successive and progressive and overlapping stages of achievement of unity in the metaphor of these 7 candles of unity that Abdul Baha had spoken of. In other words, Abdul Baha had spoken that there must be unity in language, must be a unity of a political nature, must be a unity of a geographic nature. These 7 candles. But Shoghi Effendi makes it clear that these are not sort of step 1, 2, 3 that must follow exactly in the order that he gives it. In fact, these are successive, progressive, and overlapping stages that in different parts of the world, in different societies, may come about at different times. And this is, again, a lesson that we draw by applying the wisdom, the insights that Shoghi Effendi gives us in these letters to the problems of the world in which we live right now. In some parts of the world, some of these problems are closer to solution. Who would have thought 100 years ago that France and Germany, mortal enemies over several centuries of warfare in Europe, would be the closest allies at this time? And who would have thought that a union of first 11, now growing close to 20 different European states, slowly erasing those barriers that exist among them. Most of them have now adopted a common currency. There's no need for border checks and visas and things like that traveling. Who would have thought that this would have been possible even 50 years ago? I would say even 30 years ago. And yet it's happening. And you look at seemingly irremediable problems like the problems in the Middle East between the Jews and the Arabs, and who knows that within some foreseeable time, the same kind of solutions that are emerging in Europe might not emerge there also. Somebody once said that when human beings have exhausted all unreasonable approaches to a problem, if they're still alive, they may turn to the reasonable. And this is what might happen. All right. Now, then Shoghi Effendi speaks about the need for a world super state. And he says that it is inevitable. It's not just something that we are dreaming about. Again, think of this against the tremendous hue and cry, the noise that is raised, even in our own country, against sensible things that, for example, creation of an international criminal court, as a step in direction not of a super state, but at least of a kind of an international cooperation. Yet, narrow-minded provincialism, insularity, resists it on the premise that this may reduce the absolute sovereignty of a nation. And you can see how retrograde, how regressive that kind of thinking is. I'm not trying to tell you, dear friends, to go out there and take on these political cavemen, personally. That's not how we deal with them. But it's important to at least have a clear understanding of where we Baha'is stand with them. I might say a word on this issue. As we know, we Baha'is do not participate in partisan politics. And of course, all of these issues are matters of partisanship today. But non-interference in partisan politics does not mean political idiocy. It does not mean that we Baha'is put our head in the sand and do not take measure of what is going on around us and make a clear understanding and come up with an answer. That's precisely the lesson that Shoghi Effendi has left with us. This analysis, this insightful, detailed, clear analysis of the world situation is example of Shoghi Effendi not hiding, not brushing all of these things under the carpet, but just facing it. But it's important that we are aware, but what we do about it is not confrontational. What we do about it is not partisan. Okay. Then, I said in the same vein, he speaks about differentiating between that diseased supernationalism with an unfettered and natural love of one's country. In other words, patriotism has a sane and perfectly understandable, place in all our hearts. And when we are talking about a world superstate, it does not mean that we are turning our back to our own country. But it's this absolute sovereignty of the nation state, which is really an obsolete thing. And you view the current behavior of nations, especially our own nation, and you see that some of it is really equivalent of behavior of a very selfish young brat. If we translate the group behavior of super patriots to the individual behavior, that's all me and nobody else, and that I am the only one who deserves all the good things, everybody else is suspect. You translate that to individual behavior, you see that any psychologist would tell you that this is a very selfish and unhealthy child. And yet, as groups, we allow ourselves that kind of behavior. And Shoghi Effendi speaks about unity in diversity. Again, a phrase that for a long time was almost a monopoly of Baha'i usage, but of recent times, you notice that it's entering the jargon of our time. And again, different people may mean different things by it, but we are quite clear that this principle of unity in diversity is the sane and intelligent patriotism, autonomy, and the acceptance of meeting and interchange of cultures, and it's against any kind of provincialism and insularity. And then finally, the principle of oneness of mankind, he says, is no mere emotionalism, no mere utopian dreaming, that it needs the infrastructure and the institutions which Baha'u'llah has provided for it. An organic change in the behavior of human beings is inevitable in order to bring about this principle of oneness. And he uses again the example of the federation of mankind on the model of United States. And then he ends this letter with something that, again, we Baha'is sometimes think in terms of as a one-time event or one-time threat, but it isn't. And I'm going to quote exactly what he talks about, the fire of ordeal, which may be the means by which these goals of world order will be achieved. He says, one word more in conclusion. The proclamation of the oneness of mankind, the head cornerstone of Baha'u'llah's all-embracing dominion, can under no circumstances be compared with such expressions of pious hope as have been uttered in the past. His is not merely a call which he raised alone and unaided in the face of the relentless and combined opposition of two of the most powerful Oriental potentates of his day, while himself an exile and prisoner in their hands. It implies at once a warning and a promise. A warning that in it lies the sole means for the salvation of a greatly suffering world, a promise that its realization is at hand. And finally, it says that, and what voice other than that of Baha'u'llah, the mouthpiece of God for this age, is capable of effecting a transformation of society as radical as that which he has already accomplished in the hearts of those men and women so diversified and seemingly irreconcilable who constitute the body of his declared followers throughout the world. So, Shoghi Effendi is essentially presenting us, a handful of Baha'is, as example of the already accomplished miracle of Baha'u'llah to the rest of the world, the transformation that he has brought about in our lives. So when you realize that we stand as testaments to the validity, to the power of the cause of Baha'u'llah, then we get a little more sobering and inspiring and reassuring sense of who we are at this time in this world. That's the first letter. Okay. Now, I shall attempt a short review of the letter, which is called America and the Most Great Peace. All right. It's a letter that was sent in April of 1933. And it begins with the first of a number of historical reviews that Shoghi Effendi attempted in subsequent years, the most important of which was, of course, God Passes By. That was really a review of the first 100 years of the faith. But here, he reviews the first 40 years of the establishment of the faith, or at least raising the name of Baha'u'llah on the continent of North America. This is, I told you, I think, this changing perspective of time that happens as you get older, that I remember when I first came to this country in February of 1944, in the city of San Francisco. Virtually the entire Baha'i community had seen Abdul Baha on his visit in 1912. And for me, a 17-year-old boy at that time, said, oh, these ancient relics, they are from from another era. It seemed that far away. And now, 60 years later, believe me, I feel closer to 1912 and to presence of Abdul Baha in San Francisco as I did then. I'm looking at you, Parveen. I hear that your daughter is now a member of the local spiritual assembly of Baha'is of San Francisco. So I'm sure that she wasn't there in 1912, but Abdul Baha visited. But isn't that wonderful how these links are forged, how our own lives are so closely intertwined with the unfolding history of the faith. Anyway, this, at the time when this letter was written, it was only 40 years since the name of Baha'u'llah was raised in America. And in the opening parts of this letter, Shoghi Effendi gives us a historical review. What is important in it is not, the events are in themselves interesting. Anybody who's a history buff would like to know who it was and where it was that first, mentioned the name of Baha'u'llah and so on. But what is much more important than the events and these names are the patterns that Shoghi Effendi discerns in this already 40-year history, patterns that since then have been repeated even with greater dramatic force, and that is a pattern of crisis and triumph. Crisis and triumph. Somehow it seems that the cause of God needs that dynamic impetus, that re-energizing through crisis, and that is what has happened. He speaks about activities of enemies of the faith, of covenant breakers, of people who resisted the establishment of the administrative order. All of those things, the details are not important. It's just that when you think of it, since 1931 up until our own time, so much of these same cycles of crisis and triumph have continued. And then he makes a wonderful historical contrast, or I should say analogy, draws a parallel. And this is something that Shoghi Effendi was fond of and he was so good at, and that is seeing things that initially may not appear to our eyes as significant parallel events in history. He says that you think that in some of the major religious movements of the past, the birthplace has been somewhere in the East, but the flourishing and the coming to full fruition has occurred further out in the West. And this is not just a coincidence or not just a sort of random thing that he notices. It has to do with the potentiality of the Word of God to make its impact in the farthest reaches possible of those of its own time. Obviously, in the time of Christ or of Muhammad, one could not expect those faiths to reach the Western Hemisphere because people in the old world did not know about existence of Western Hemisphere. But he makes the point that Christianity, born in Jerusalem, first established in a number of churches in Antioch and Jerusalem and elsewhere, but ultimately, when it was transferred or reached Constantinople and Rome, it gained its full potentiality and became the source of a new, civilization. And Shoghi Effendi makes the comment that probably because those Eastern churches were made up almost exclusively of Jewish converts to Christianity, and they perhaps did not have the vision to easily see beyond the horizon of the Old Testament. And it was for people totally unlimited, unrestricted by those horizons, that is the Greeks and the Romans, to achieve a greater and fuller understanding of Christianity. And then he says, in case of Islam also, it was born in Arabia, but the Arabian Peninsula was far too impoverished in many ways, spiritually, politically, in every way, to be able to sustain the dynamism and the emergence of the new civilization of Islam. And it wasn't until it was moved further out of Arabia into Damascus and Baghdad and Andalusia that the full impact of Islam was felt. And he then makes a case that the spread of the faith from the east to the westernmost possible place in the world, that is the Western Hemisphere and specifically the North American continent, is a similar phenomenon that is taking place, and it is not simply because of lack of capacity of the East or let's say any other reason except to demonstrate the power of the Word of God to energize and to bring out this great building force in the world. Then he says that the destiny of the continent of America, I better read that directly from what he has to say about the destiny of this continent. The continent of America, he, that is Abdul Baha, announced in a tablet unveiling his divine plan to the believers residing in the northeastern states of the American Republic. It says, the continent of America is in the eyes of the one true God, the land wherein the splendors of his light shall be revealed, where the mysteries of his faith shall be unveiled, where the righteous will abide and the free assemble. May this American democracy, he himself, while in America, was heard to remark, be the first nation to establish the foundation of international agreement. May it be the first nation to proclaim the unity of mankind. May it be the first to unfurl the standard of the most great peace. Please think of all of these things in relation to the role that the United States is playing in the world now. May America become the distributing center of spiritual enlightenment, and all the world receive this heavenly blessing. For America has developed powers and capacities greater and more wonderful than other nations. May the inhabitants of this country become the angels of heaven with faces turned continually toward God. May all of them become servants of the Omnipotent. May they rise from their present material attainments to such a height that heavenly illumination may stream from this center to all the peoples of the world. This American nation is equipped and empowered to accomplish that which will adorn the pages of history, to become the envy of the world, and be blessed in both the East and the West for the triumph of its people. The American continent gives signs and evidences of very great advancement. Its future is even more promising, for its influence and illumination are far-reaching. It will lead all nations spiritually. Then he gives a wonderful set of contrasts. I think that just in case any of us in America would become a little too complacent or puff up too much with pride at all these wonderful things that Abdul Baha has said, Shoghi Effendi draws some contrasts for us. And these contrasts, believe me, dear friends, are that much more evident in our time than they were 70 years ago. Let me read them to you. He says, contrast the sad plight of the nations of the earth, and in particular, this great republic of the West, with the rising fortunes of that handful of its citizens whose mission, if they be faithful to their trust, is to heal its wounds, restore its confidence, and revive its shattered hopes. You know, he's asking us, Baha'is, to be the yeast that leavens this whole dough of otherwise sagging and sad and trouble-ridden society. See? Contrast the dreadful convulsions, the internecine conflicts, the petty disputes, the outworn controversies, the interminable revolutions that agitate the masses, with the calm new light of peace and of truth which envelops, guides, and sustains those valiant inheritors of the law and love of Baha'u'llah. This is wonderful. The law and love of Baha'u'llah. American Baha'is who received this letter in 1931 did not as yet have access to the Kitab Aqdas, the book of laws of Baha'u'llah, and they did not know how Baha'u'llah equates law and love, which is absolutely a mind-boggling, novel conception of law. And he says, obey my laws for love of my beauty. See? But here Shoghi Effendi is already giving an intimation of that. See, that valiant inheritors of the law and love of Baha'u'llah. Compare the disintegrating institutions, the discredited statesmanship, the exploded theories, the appalling degradation, the follies and furies, the shifts, shams, and compromises that characterize the present age, with the steady consolidation, the holy discipline, the unity and cohesiveness, the assured conviction, the uncompromising loyalty, the heroic self-sacrifice that constitute the hallmark of these faithful stewards and harbingers of the golden age of the faith of Baha'u'llah. Then he makes reference to the signal importance of the visit of Abdul Baha to this continent, and how he really was the one who not only spread the seeds, but who prepared the land for the growth and fruition of those seeds. And in this passage, Shoghi Effendi does something absolutely wonderful. It's really one of those literary masterpieces of his writings, in that he puts in the mouth or in the pen of Abdul Baha what it's Shoghi Effendi who's saying it, but it's as if he's hearing the voice of the master who's been gone for 10 years. And you get, this is one of those marvelous passages in his writings where you see this person of Shoghi Effendi as the guardian, as the appointed interpreter and expounder of the writings of Baha'u'llah, speaking as Abdul Baha. Let me read this to you. It's an imaginary farewell of Abdul Baha to the American Baha'is on his departure from this continent. Through the agency of Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah's covenant, I, meaning Abdul Baha, this is the writing of Shoghi Effendi, I, as the plowman, have been called upon since the beginning of my ministry to turn up and break its ground. The mighty confirmations that have, in the opening days of your career, rained upon you have prepared and invigorated its soil. The tribulations you subsequently were made to suffer have driven deep furrows in the field which my hands had prepared. The seeds with which I have been entrusted, I have now scattered far and wide before you. Under your loving care, by your ceaseless exertions, every one of these seeds must germinate. Every one must yield its destined fruit. A winter of unprecedented severity will soon be upon you. Its storm clouds are fast gathering on the horizon. Tempestuous winds will assail you from every side. The light of the covenant will be obscured through my departure. These mighty blasts, this wintry desolation shall, however, pass away. The dormant seed will burst into fresh activity. It shall put forth its buds, shall reveal in mighty institutions its leaves and blossoms. The vernal showers which the tender mercies of my heavenly Father will cause to descend upon you will enable this tender plant to spread out its branches to regions far beyond the confines of your native land. And finally, the steadily mounting sun of his revelation, shining in its meridian splendor, will enable this mighty tree of his faith to yield in the fullness of time and on your soil its golden fruit. Then Shoghi Effendi talks about Abdul Baha's last gift of love and favor to the North American Baha'i community, and that is the tablets of divine plan, and through which the spiritual conquest of the whole planet becomes possible. And then he talks about the administrative order as it emerges from the will and testament of Abdul Baha and all of its infrastructure are created first in the North American Baha'i community and from here transferred to other parts of the world. If you look at the establishment of Baha'i institutions, national assemblies, local assemblies, you see how that pattern goes. It's first in the United States, then in Egypt, then in Iraq, and Germany, and in Britain, and in other places. And finally, he speaks in the conclusion of this message to the fellow believers. I'd like to read this part. Fellow believers in the American continent, great indeed have been your past and present achievements. Immeasurably greater are the wonders which the future has in store for you. The edifice your sacrifices have raised still remains to be clothed. The house which must needs be supported by the highest administrative institution your hands have reared is as yet unbuilt. The provisions of the chief repository of those laws that must govern its operation are thus far mostly undisclosed. The standard which, if Abdul Baha's wishes are to be fulfilled, must be raised in your own country has yet to be unfurled. The unity of which that standard is to be the symbol is far from being yet established. The machinery which must needs incarnate and preserve that unity is not even created. And he ends the letter. I say that the past, her past, that is America's past, has been a testimony to the inexhaustible vitality of her faith. May not her future confirm it? Now, one, as I've said at the beginning, all of these statements stand out with far more greater meaning and urgency when seen against the current background. And I want to end with one observation here, and that is when Shoghi Effendi says, fellow believers in the American continent. That, dear friends, includes all of us. In this faith of Baha'u'llah, American Baha'is are not counted on the basis of ethnicity, of language, or of where they came from. Are the Baha'is who are part of this community residing in a society whose history, whose social and spiritual dynamics have given it this tremendous potential, and every one of us, whether we are born in Persia or India or wherever, we are, as we live here, fellow believers in the American continent. So these remarks are addressed to all of us. I didn't want anyone to feel that, well, he's so kind to the Americans, but we're left aside. We are it, fellows. All right? So I'll end here. I think that I spoke far too long. Maybe now you want to ask questions or do whatever you like. Yes, you're absolutely right. And I want to say that you've got to put this, in as part of a much larger global impact of the faith. And you see that just about all different societies who have been exposed to the message of Baha'u'llah and who have shown some kind of a response are the recipients of wonderful encouragement and emphasis of their special talents and powers and role in the future. The Japanese can point out to tablets of Abdul Baha, talks about their particular future in the faith. The Chinese can do the same. Certainly the Persian Baha'i community throughout, with all of its sacrifices and all of the commendation that I've received from Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, Shoghi Effendi, House of Justice can do that. And I can go down the list, so that it's not, in a sense, a kind of ranking of, well, you're number one, this is number two, something like this, but that the special potentialities and strengths of each one of these cultures is emphasized, and they're urged to bring it forth for the fulfillment of the ultimate dream that we have, creating the World Order of Baha'u'llah. And in case of North America, you're absolutely right. Was the response of those early heroic figures, and the fact that they acted on their faith. They just didn't, change their name from whatever to Baha'i, but they really went out. Who was Martha Ruth? Who was Agnes Alexander? Who were these, people who, or Mother Dunn, or to go to Australia? These people obviously were magnets of all of this favor. And it's something that I should mention at this time. I should have mentioned it earlier, that these are references to North American Baha'is, which includes Canada. Very often, we in the United States think that it only talks about the United States. There are parts that are addressed, tablets of the divine plan are made up of a set of 5 different tablets, to 4 of them to 4 different clusters of American states, and 1 to Canadian provinces and things like that. But remember that the establishment of the administrative order on this continent was jointly done with Baha'is of Canada and United States. The National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of United States and Canada were one until 1948. And this is, I think, I don't know that there are any Canadians in the crowd feel good about that or not, but I think that we should remember that. Making such generalizations always make me uncomfortable. You say that Europeans are more nationalistic. I think that the display of jingoism and nationalism in this country is just as offensive as you'll find anywhere. But by and large, the fact that this society was born with fewer traditional restrictions that exist in all societies, and greater opportunities for multiple or diverse development has existed. And the fact that good many of the people who came to this country came to escape those restrictions, and never mind that good many of them have tried to replicate some of those restrictions on the new continent as well. But there is this greater potentiality, and certainly we have to take the words of Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, that spiritual potential is very strong. It doesn't mean that we are at all times to sit back and be confident that Americans will behave spiritually and things like that. We are going, in fact, through a phase where a lot of contrary characteristics, a lot of insularity, a lot of nationalism, a lot of divisiveness, a lot of fanaticism, religious fanaticism, all of those things are on the rise. These are all, you might say, parts of the symptoms of the disease of the old order, which right now is going through a crisis. And hopefully the patient will sweat and survive and get out of it and once again begin to manifest its more creative and more positive potential. That's what Shoghi Effendi tells us. That's what Abdul Baha told us. That's what I think that in all fairness you can also see that for every ugly American, so-called, I'm taking that, there are also some very beautiful Americans. And the beautiful Americans are probably there in larger number than beautiful other people.